A boot heel caught a man square in the ribs. He folded, gasping, blood on his teeth. 3 more kicks landed before they hauled him up by the collar. A rope went around one ankle. Somebody threw the loose end over a thick branch and pulled. The man rose into the air upside down, swinging, his arms hanging toward the dirt. A motorcycle lay smashed in the ditch below him, one wheel still spinning. The men climbed onto their own bikes. Engines roared. Gravel sprayed. They were gone, leaving him to die alone on an empty back road. His name was Travis Kane. The club he had bled for had just left him hanging like meat. Nobody drove that road after dark. Nobody, that is, except an old couple in a rusted pickup who happened by at the wrong hour. What would they do? Stay with me on this one. The truck was a 1962 Ford with a bad starter and a worse muffler. Earl Whitlock drove it the way he did everything, slow and careful, both hands on the wheel. Beside him sat his wife, Marion, with a paper sack of groceries on her lap and a thermos wedged between her feet. In the bed of the truck, riding the way he always rode, stood a blue heeler named Scout. The dog had one ear up and one ear down, and he never missed a thing that moved. They were coming home from town. Coon Hollow, Arizona, was barely a town at all. A feed store, a diner, a gas pump, and a church that doubled as everything else. It was autumn of 1979, and the light was going gold and long across the desert. Earl liked this hour. He'd seen too many bad ones to waste a good one. They drove most of that road in the kind of quiet that only comes from 40 years together. Marion had picked up thread and a bag of peppermints she pretended were for Earl. Earl was thinking about the south fence and whether it would hold another winter. Ordinary thoughts. The thoughts of 2 people who believed the dangerous part of their lives was long behind them. He almost drove right past the tree. It was Scout who caught it first. The dog barked once, sharp, then again, and threw his weight against the side of the truck bed. Earl slowed. Marion leaned forward and squinted through the dusty windshield. "Earl," she said, "there's something in that mesquite." He stopped the truck. The engine ticked, and then they both saw it at the same time, and Marion put her hand over her mouth. A man hung from the old mesquite by one ankle, swaying just slightly, his arms loose and his head pointed at the ground. Below him, down in the ditch, a motorcycle lay on its side, twisted and broken. Earl had seen men hung like that before, in another country, a long time ago. His stomach went cold the same way it always had. "He might be alive," Marion said. Earl was already out of the truck. "Now, here's the thing you have to understand about Earl Whitlock. He was 71 years old. He had a bad hip and a hearing aid he never wore. He weighed maybe 160 pounds soaking wet. But for 2 years in the Pacific and another year somewhere he didn't talk about, he had been an army medic, and a medic doesn't ask whether a wounded man deserves saving. A medic just goes. He came up under the hanging man slow, talking low the whole way. 'Easy now, easy. I've got you. Don't you fight me.' The man wasn't fighting anybody. He was barely breathing. Up close, Earl could see what they'd done to him. One eye swollen shut. His lip split clean through. He wore a leather vest, what the bikers called a cut, and across the back of it were patches and a winged skull. Most folks in Coon Hollow had crossed the street from men wearing those colors. You saw that vest, you looked away and you kept walking. Earl did not look away. "Marion," he called, "bring my knife from the glove box, and steady the head when I cut him down. He's going to drop hard." Marion Whitlock was 68. She had buried a son and raised 2 daughters and nursed Earl through a fever that should have killed him in 1951. She did not flinch at much anymore. She knelt in the dirt under that swinging stranger, this woman in her church dress, and she cradled his bloody head in both her hands like he was something precious. "I've got him," she said. "Cut." Earl's field knife was older than the marriage. He reached up, gripped the rope, and sawed. The whole time, Scout stood at the edge of the road facing the empty distance where the engines had gone, a low growl rolling in his chest. The dog understood something the people hadn't said out loud yet. Whoever did this might come back, and he might come back soon. The rope was thick and wet with blood, and it fought the blade. Earl kept his arm up and steady, the way he'd kept it steady over 100 men who never knew his name. His bad hip screamed. He didn't stop. The rope parted. The man came down. Earl took the weight he could and Marion took the rest. And together the three of them, the old man, the old woman, and the dog standing guard, got Travis Kane out of that ditch and into the bed of the rusted Ford. He groaned once. It was the first sound he'd made. "Hospital's an hour," Earl said, climbing back behind the wheel. "He hasn't got an hour." "Then we take him home," Marion said. It wasn't a question. And that's exactly what they did. The Whitlock place sat at the end of a long gravel drive, a low ranch house with a porch Earl had built with his own hands the year Eisenhower was elected. They got the stranger onto the kitchen table, the same table where they ate every meal, because it was the only surface big enough and the light over it was good. Marion boiled water. Earl scrubbed his hands to the elbow like he'd been taught a lifetime ago, then laid out what he had. Sewing needles, fishing line, the thin, clear kind, a bottle of whiskey he kept for company that never came, clean rags torn from an old bedsheet. It wasn't a hospital, but it would have to do, and Earl had worked with far less in far worse places. He went to work. He set the broken nose with 2 fingers and a steady pressure. He stitched the split lip and the gash above the eyebrow, small even stitches, the way only hands with 1,000 wounds behind them can sew. He ran his palms along the man's sides and felt 3 ribs give where they shouldn't, and he bound them tight. He checked the eyes and the breathing and the color of the gums, the things a medic checks before he believes a man will last the night. Twice, he pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck and waited, counting, before he went on. "He's strong," Earl murmured, more to himself than to Marion. "Whatever else he is. He's strong." He poured whiskey into the deep cut on the man's forearm, and the stranger came roaring up off the table, swinging blind, and it took everything Earl and Marion had to hold him down. "You're safe," Marion kept saying into his ear. "You're safe, son. Nobody here is going to hurt you." Slowly the words got through. The man stopped fighting. His one good eye found her face, this gentle old woman holding him steady, and something in him broke that had nothing to do with his ribs. He started to shake. Earl had seen that too. It wasn't pain. It was a man realizing he was still alive when he'd already made his peace with dying. Why would they do it? That's the question, isn't it? Why would 2 old people take in the kind of man the whole town had spent years avoiding? They didn't know his name yet. They didn't know what he'd done. They only knew he was hurt, and they were the ones who'd found him. And in the Whitlock house, that had always been enough. It took most of the night. Somewhere past 2 in the morning, the man's breathing finally went deep and even. Near dawn, the stranger slept, stitched and bound and tucked under a quilt Marion had made by hand. Earl sat at the table with his coffee gone cold and looked at the leather cut hanging over the back of a chair. The winged skull stared back at him. He knew what that patch meant. He knew the kind of trouble it could bring up his gravel drive. He folded it once gently and set it aside. He didn't say a word about it to Marion. She knew anyway. She always did. She came and stood behind him and put both hands on his shoulders, and the 2 of them watched the gray light come up over the desert without saying anything at all. The man slept for the better part of 2 days. When he finally came around for good, he opened his one good eye to the sight of a low ceiling, a quilt, and an old dog lying on the floor beside the bed watching him. "Where am I?" he rasped. "You're in our house," Marion said from the doorway. She came in with a bowl of broth. "You've been here 3 days. You're going to be all right, though for a while there I wasn't sure. Can you sit up?" He could, barely. She fed him the broth a spoonful at a time because his hands wouldn't hold the bowl steady. He watched her the whole time with a wariness that broke her heart, like a beaten dog waiting for the next kick. "Why'd you do it?" he finally asked. "Do what?" "Cut me down. People like you don't cut down people like me. You leave us hanging, that's how it works." Marion set down the spoon. "Well," she said, "that may be how it works where you come from. It isn't how it works here." His name was Travis Kane, though for 15 years almost nobody had called him that. In the club he was Diesel. He was an enforcer, and you don't need me to spell out what that job involved. He'd done time. He'd done worse than time. He'd given the better part of his life to a club that called itself a brotherhood, and 3 days ago that brotherhood had beaten him half to death and strung him up to die. It came out slow, over the days that followed, in pieces. Earl never pushed. He'd sit on the edge of the bed in the evening and change the dressings, and sometimes Diesel talked and sometimes he didn't, and either way was fine with Earl. He had a way of waiting that wasn't really waiting. He'd just go on with his hands and let the silence be. That, more than the broth or the stitches, was the thing that started to bring Travis Kane back from wherever he'd gone. What had he done to earn that rope? He'd refused an order. That was all he'd say at first. He'd been given a job and he'd said no, and saying no to that club was the one thing you could not do. Earl didn't ask what the order was, not then. He just nodded and went on wrapping the ribs. 3 weeks passed. I want you to picture those 3 weeks because they matter. A hardened enforcer and 2 old church people and a blue heeler, all under one roof. Diesel got strong enough to walk, then strong enough to sit on the porch in the evenings. Marion fed him until the gauntness left his face. Earl put him to work, easy work, fixing the fence, oiling the gate, the kind of work a man can do while his ribs knit. They never asked him for a dime. They never asked him for anything. It didn't come easy at first. The first week, Diesel barely slept. He'd be up at every sound, every coyote, every gust against the window, sure it was engines coming back up the drive. Once a delivery truck turned around at the end of the gravel, and Diesel was on his feet with a kitchen knife before he even knew he'd moved, and Earl had to talk him down quiet, the way you talk a spooked horse out of a stall. Earl knew that jumpiness. He'd carried it home from the Pacific himself, and it had taken Marion the better part of a decade to coax it out of him. He recognized it the way you recognize your own face. But day by day, a strange thing happened. The hardest man any of them had ever met started to soften at the edges. He laughed once at something Earl said and looked surprised at the sound of it, like he'd forgotten he could. He learned the names of the chickens, which Marion insisted on giving them, and pretended he thought it was foolish while he scattered their feed by hand each morning. He took to sleeping on the porch some nights just to be near the dog, who decided, in the way dogs do, that this dangerous stranger was now one of his people. There was one evening that Earl never forgot. He came around the side of the house and found Diesel just standing in the yard, not working, just standing, watching the light go down over the mesas with the dog leaned against his leg. The big man's shoulders were shaking. He wasn't making a sound. Earl didn't say anything. He just walked up and stood beside him, the two of them shoulder to shoulder, and after a while Diesel wiped his face with the back of his hand and said, "Lo, I keep waiting for the part where you tell me what you want." And Earl said, "There isn't one, son." And they stood there together until it was full dark. One evening near the end of those 3 weeks, the three of them sat on the porch watching the sun go down behind the mesas. Scout lay across Diesel's boots. Marion had iced tea going around. Earl was whittling something small and shapeless the way he did when his hands needed occupying. "I've never had this," Diesel said quietly. Nobody had asked him anything. The words just came. "A house, people who don't want something. I didn't know it was real. I thought it was something they put in commercials to sell you things." Marion reached over and patted his scarred hand. "It's real," she said. "You're in it." The dog sighed. The sun went down, and for one long, gentle moment everything was as peaceful as it had ever been on that quiet stretch of road. The danger felt 100 miles away. You could almost believe it was over, that the worst had already happened under that mesquite tree, and now there was only the slow healing left. That's what they all believed, sitting on that porch. They were wrong. It was Scout who heard it first, just like before. The dog came up off the porch board stiff-legged, ears pinned, a growl building deep in his chest. A second later the rest of them heard it too. A sound rolling up out of the dark from the main road, low and growing. Engines, not one, not two, a dozen, maybe more, all of them coming up the long gravel drive. Diesel's face went gray. He stood so fast he knocked over the tea. "They found me," he said. "Oh God, they found me. You have to hide, both of you, now." And right there is where this stopped being one kind of story and became another. Because up until that moment it had been about a wounded man healing, about kindness given to someone who hadn't earned it, a gentle thing. But those headlights coming up the drive weren't there to settle a score with Diesel anymore. Diesel finally told them the truth, fast, the words tumbling out, and it turned everything cold. The order he'd refused, the thing that got him strung up. The club had been paid to run an old couple off a piece of land at the end of a back road. A piece of land that sat right on a route they wanted to use, quiet and far from any sheriff. The job was to scare them, burn them out, make them disappear if it came to that. And the old couple they'd sent Diesel to handle. It was Earl and Marion. He'd ridden out 3 weeks ago to do the job, and he'd seen them in their yard. This old man and old woman feeding chickens and minding their own, and something in him that he thought had died a long time ago had refused. He'd gone back and told the club no. So they beat him, and they hung him on the tree at the edge of the very property he wouldn't touch, as a message. And then fate, or God, or dumb luck, had sent that rusted Ford down the road, and the people he'd refused to hurt had cut him down and saved his life and never once known. Now the club was coming to finish all of it at once. The brother who'd betrayed them, and the couple on the land. "Get in the house," Earl said, not panicked, quiet, the same voice he'd used under the mesquite tree. Diesel grabbed his arm. "You don't understand these men, there's no talking to them. The one out front, they call him Reaper, he will kill all 3 of us and sleep fine. You have to run." Earl looked at him. "I'm 71 years old, son. I'm not running anywhere. And these are my chickens and my fence and my wife. So I'll handle it." He went inside. Diesel thought for one wild second that the old man was going for a gun. But Earl came back out with no gun. He came back out carrying the leather cut, Diesel's colors, the winged skull. He'd kept it folded clean these 3 weeks. He handed it to Diesel. "Put it on," Earl said. "Stand on your own porch like a man. Whatever happens, you don't face them on your knees." The bikes roared up into the yard and stopped, a dozen headlights pinning the porch in white light, and the engines cut one by one until there was only the ticking of hot metal and the dog growling low. "If you've made it with me this far and your heart's pounding a little, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button. Stories like this one, they're getting harder to find, and you staying is what keeps them coming." All right, back to the porch. The man they called Reaper swung off his bike. He was huge, military big, with a gray beard and arms like fence posts and eyes that had nothing behind them at all. He looked at Diesel standing on the porch in his colors and he smiled, and it was the worst smile any of them had ever seen. "Well," Reaper said, "Diesel, we hung you good, tough old root, aren't you?" Then his dead eyes moved to Earl and Marion. "And here's the lot of you all in one place. That's convenient, saves me gas." Scout's growl climbed. Earl put a hand on the dog's head and he went quiet, but he did not lie down. "You're on my property," Earl said. Reaper laughed. The men behind him laughed. "Your property? Old man, by morning there isn't going to be a property. Or a you." He started up the porch steps, slow, taking his time, the way a man does when he's done this many times and likes it. Last words. "Go on, I'm feeling generous." Earl Whitlock did not back up. He did not reach for a weapon. He looked up at this enormous killer climbing his steps, and he said one quiet thing. "I knew a man named Bobby Reardon. You favor him, around the eyes." Reaper stopped. "He bled out in my arms outside Pusan in 1950, Earl went on in that same low, even voice. 18 years old, took a round in the gut. I held his stomach in with my 2 hands for 4 hours and he lived. He had a little brother back home he wouldn't stop talking about, a baby brother named after their daddy." Earl tilted his head. "Named Daniel. They called him Danny." The big man on the steps had gone very still. "You called yourself Reaper just now," Earl said. "But your mama named you Daniel Reardon, didn't she?" Nobody moved. The dozen bikers behind their leader looked at his back, confused. The dead-eyed killer stood frozen on an old man's porch steps, and something was happening behind his eyes that none of his men had ever seen there. "My brother died over there," Reaper said. His voice had changed. It had cracks in it now. 1950, they sent home a flag, said some medic kept him alive long enough to write us a letter. We got the letter after the telegram." He stared at Earl. "You're lying. You're an old man trying to save his neck." "He had a scar on his left hand shaped like a fishhook," Earl said. "He got it on a trot line when he was 9. He told me the story twice while I was holding him together. I remember every man I couldn't save and every man I could. Your brother lived 3 more weeks because of these hands. That's all anybody got. But it was 3 weeks." Earl's voice didn't waver. "These 3 weeks passed, I gave the same to one of yours. I didn't know who he was. I just found a hurt man on a rope and I cut him down. I don't ask what a man's done. I never have. I just go." The yard was dead silent. You could hear the wind moving through the mesquite at the edge of the property. The tree where it had all started. Marion stepped forward then, this small old woman, and she did the most shocking thing of the whole night. She walked right past her husband, right up to the killer on the steps, close enough to touch him, and she put her hand flat on his chest the same way she'd held a bloody stranger's head in the dirt. "Daniel," she said softly, "you're tired, aren't you? You've been tired a long, long time." And the man called Reaper, the enforcer the whole desert was afraid of, sat down on an old man's porch steps and put his enormous face in his enormous hands and wept like the boy he hadn't been since 1950. Nobody said a word. The room of the whole world just went dead quiet. Behind him, the other bikers stood in the headlight glare not knowing what to do. They'd come to kill. They didn't have a thing in their playbook for this. One by one, their engines stayed off. One by one, they looked away from the sight of their leader breaking on the steps, the way men look away from something too private to watch. Diesel came down off the porch slow. He stood in front of the men he'd ridden with for 15 years, the men who'd hung him on a tree, and he didn't raise a fist. He just looked at them. "This is the family that cut me down," he said. "After what we did, they didn't know who I was and they did it anyway. They fed me at their table. This old man stitched me with his own hands." He pointed back at the tree. "We left me right there to die. They're the only people in my whole life ever treated me like I was worth saving. So if you're going to do this, you do it through me first. I mean that." Nobody moved through him. Reaper finally stood up off the steps. His face was wet and he didn't bother to hide it. He looked at Earl a long time. "The land deal's dead," he said, his voice rough. "There is no deal. I don't care what we got paid. Anybody's got a problem with that, they can take it up with me." He looked at his men. Not one of them had a problem with it. And if anybody ever comes up this road to bother these people, they answer to the whole club. You understand me? These two are under our protection now. Till the day they die. He turned back to Earl, and he did something nobody expected. This giant of a man held out his hand, and when Earl took it, Reaper covered the old medic's hand with both of his own, exactly the way Earl had once covered a dying boy's wound. "Thank you," he said, "for my brother's 3 weeks. I never got to say it. 40 years I never got to say it." "You just did," Earl said. "They didn't stay long after that. There wasn't much left to say, and some moments you don't stretch past their meaning." The engines fired up, one by one, and the long line of taillights went back down the gravel drive and out onto the road. But it was different than the first time, 3 weeks before. The first time those engines had left a man to die. This time they left 3 people standing safe on their own porch in the dark. Diesel stayed. He didn't ride out with them, and nobody asked him to. He stood on the porch between Earl and Marion and watched the last red light disappear, and when it was gone, he let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 15 years. "I don't have anywhere to be," he said. It came out almost like a question. "Fence on the south line still needs doing," Earl said. "There's eggs in the morning if you're up for it." That was that. He stayed through the winter. He fixed the fence and the gate and the bad starter on the Ford. He learned how Marion liked her coffee and how Earl liked his quiet. In the spring, he got honest work at the feed store in town, and you should have seen the faces the first time he walked in. This big scarred man in a clean shirt, polite as a deacon. The same folks who'd crossed the street from him now waved him down to ask after the Whitlocks. He drove them to their doctor's appointments in Phoenix. He carried the heavy things Earl couldn't carry anymore. He called them ma'am and sir until one evening Marion told him to knock it off and call them by their names. And after that he called them something else. He called them family, because that's what they'd made him. Earl Whitlock passed 4 years later in his own bed, with Marion holding one hand and Travis holding the other. The big man wept again that day, the second time anyone had seen it, and he was not ashamed. He'd long since stopped being ashamed of the soft things. Marion went 2 winters after that peaceful in her sleep. Travis Kane buried them both up on the rise behind the house, under the mesa light Earl had loved, and he tended those graves the rest of his days. He kept the place. He kept the dog's collar on a nail by the door long after old Scout was gone, buried up there with the people he'd guarded. And every so often a stranger in trouble would turn up on that long gravel drive, a hitchhiker, a runaway, somebody with nowhere else, the kind of person most folks cross the street from. Travis always took them in. He'd stitch them up if they needed it, with hands that had learned how from an old army medic. He'd feed them at the same kitchen table, and he never once asked what they'd done. If they asked him why he'd do that for a stranger, he'd tell them the truth, the same words an old man had once said to him in this very house. "I don't ask what a man's done," he'd say. "I just go." That's what those quiet old people did, the night the club rolled up the drive to kill them. They didn't run, and they didn't fight, and they didn't reach for a gun. They just held out their hands the same way they always had, to the worst men they'd ever met. And it turned out that was the strongest thing on that whole dark road. It started with a man hanging from a tree, left for dead by the only family he had. It ended with him standing safe on a porch with a new one. And the only thing that changed it, the only thing, was 2 old people who saw somebody hurting and decided that was reason enough to stop the truck. Believe me, that kind of thing is rarer than gold, and it's free to anybody willing to do it.